War Stories Part 11. The first and final voyage of the Bismarck. In early May of 1941, the crew of Bismarck had feverishly prepared for an inspection by none other than the German Führer leader, Adolf Hitler. Now he was here among them. Decks had been scrubbed, rails polished, uniforms pressed, and the ship's barber had worked his way through as many as 2,100 men. As time and his blistered fingers allowed, the visit to Germany's greatest battleship was going well. The crews, whose average age was all of 21, were immensely proud of their new vessel. As Hitler passed their assembled ranks, they stood there, faces stiff with pride and overawed to be in the presence of their leader. Not everyone on parade was impressed with Hitler, though. As he walked by an anti-aircraft gunner, Alois Hadbertse, the Nazi leader looked straight through him. Habertz shuddered. Hitler had eyes as cold and pitiless as a shark. The Fuhrer had an almost schoolboy fascination with battleships. Was taken on a tour of the ship. He seemed particularly interested in the Bismarck's gunnery control system, a state-of-the-art computer mechanism which took in the ship's speed and course, that of its enemy, wind direction, and shell flight time. This produced changes of core correction of aim at what was. I really don't understand that word, so I'm sorry. By the standard of the time, lightning speed, Hitler also noted with pride the two huge Sawicks, the emblems of the Nazi Party, painted at either end of the ship, which served to identify it to their own aircraft. Germany had a small navy, but her warships were the most advanced in the world, and the Bismarck was the pride of her fleet. A truly Gungarten war machine. Over a sixth of a mile long and bristling with huge guns, she was unquestionably the fastest and best armed and protected battleship of her day. Among the officials with Hitler on his tour inspection were Bismarck's two most senior officers. The captain was Ernest Lindemann, a stiff, rather frail-looking 45-year-old who was never seen without a cigarette. In his official appointment, Lindemann stares out at a world with piercing, intelligent eyes. His blonde hair slicked back on his head with two enormous ears. But his stern and slightly comical look was misleading. His crew held him both high regard and affection. Some even referred to him as respectfully as our father. He emanated both approachingly and confidence, and been appointed captain of the Bismarck was the greatest break in his naval career. Also sent to sea with Lindemann was the fleet commander Admiral Gunther Lutyens. Together with 50 of his staff, Lutyens was a starkly handsome 51-year-old, bearing and passing resemblance to American film actor Lee Marvin. Lutyens like Linderman and many officers in the German Navy, was not a great supporter of Hitler, and had tried not to protect the Jewish officers under his command. And had tried to protect the Jewish officers under his command. Right from the start of the war, he had believed Germany would be defeated. Perhaps that was why he was such a forbidding man to be around. And it was said that he almost never smiled or laughed, although he was a fine and experienced commander. He did not have Linderman's leadership skills, as subsequent events would show. Lugent knew the British feared his powerful ship, and that they would do everything in their considerable power to destroy it. He, more than anything, any man aboard the Bismarck, did not expect to return from this posting alive. At the stage of the war, Britain was the only major European power that's still undefeated by the Nazis. Hitler and Germany's commander-in-chief of the Navy, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, intended to use the Navy to starve their isolated island opponent into defeat. Britain's survival, after all, depended on cargo ships from other colonies in North America. So far, this tactic was working. In early 1941, the battleships Skarbonborth and Sunio had ventured out into the North Atlantic on raiding missions and sunk 22 merchant ships between them. Now in May of this year, the Bismarck was preparing to do the same. The expedition was codenamed Renibung, or Operation Rhine, and sailing out with the Bismarck was another modern ship, Prinz Eugen. This raid would be different. On previous missions, the German warships had been told to avoid battle with British Navy at all costs, and concentrate solely on destroying merchant ships. But now, so confident were the officers of the German High Command in their new warships, they had given permission for them to fight back if they came under attack. Most of their crew was invincible youth and battleship. Had no idea most of the horrors that awaited them, but a few more experienced ones had been aboarded sinking ships, and were old enough to know that the British Navy was actually quite a formidable foe. Even Grand Admiral Raeder had admitted to confidence that the surface vessel in his navy, as opposed to his lethal effective submarine fleet, could do no more than take part in a hit-and-run raids. They were heavily outnumbered by the British, who had always depended on their powerful fleet to keep control of their sprawling overseas empire and protect their trade. When Raeder heard that war had broken out with Britain, he greeted the news with resignation. Our surface forces can do no more than show that we can die gently, he declared. Almost from the start of their mission, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen were shadowed by British planes and ships, all carefully keeping out of range of their powerful guns. When news reached the British artillery, I don't know how to say that word either, that the two German ships had left Korsfjord in Norway to venture out into the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. Immediate action was taken. The Royal Navy ordered two of their own most powerful warships, Hood and Prince of Wales, to interrupt them. And these ships slipped away from their Orkney base at Scapa Flow in the early hours of May 22nd. An overall command of this force was Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, who was sailed aboard the Hood, a gray-haired, distinguished-looking man. He had the air of a venerable BBC commander wheeled out to present a royal funeral. Within a day, another great battleship, King George V, the aircraft carrier Victorious, and 4 cruisers had also set off to join them. The Hood was quite possibly the most famous battle cruiser in the world. Built in 1918, she was a handsome and formidably armed vessel, a sixth a mile from bow to stern. Hood had become a symbol of British naval power and had a fearsome reputation. During training exercises, the crew of Bismarck had to frequently run through attack and resistance tactics with Hood as their imaginary enemy. Now they were about to fight her for real. Bismarck and Prince Eugen took a course up a path to the north of Iceland and through the Denmark Straits, which separate Iceland from Greenland. Here they sailed close by a huge strath of ice which formed around the coastal waters of Greenland for most of the year. On the journey up, the 2-deck Swatskais were hurriedly covered with over a fresh coat of paint. The only aircraft out here would be British ones, such as Insida, would clearly indicate that Bismarck was an enemy ship. It was in these chilly waters that the Hood and the Prince of Wales raced up to interrupt them. This far north during spring and summer nightfalls for a few hours or not at all. In late May, dawn came before 2 a.m., casting a pale gray light over a heaving sea, dotted by patches of fog, brief flurries of snow. Men stationed in lookout posts aboard the ships longed to scuttle back to the cozy fug of their cramped quarters. As a biting wind gnawed at their bones, an icy spray whipped over the bows to sting their numb faces. This desolate spot near the frozen top of the world was one of the most dismal places on Earth. Aboard the German ships, crews were expecting an imminent attack, but they had no real idea how close the British actually were. The cruisers Suffolk had sighted them just after 11 in the evening on May 23rd. Alerted, Vice Admiral Holland closed in at once. At 5 the next morning, he was expecting to sight his enemy at any minute. Sure enough, 2 ships were spotted at 5:30 a.m. Black dots, 2:07 km, 17 miles away on the northwest horizon. On Bismarck and Prince Eugen, the crews had spent an anxious night. There had been several false alarms as hydrophone sound detection. Operators thought they had picked up an incoming rumble of British engines, but it was a radio message from German headquarters, who had been monitoring British transmissions, that told them their enemy was almost upon them. Just after the message arrived, looked out, spotted 2 more smoke trails from the funnels of approaching British on the southeast horizon. Even then, the Germans were not sure this was an attack. Perhaps they are still being shadowed by smaller vessels. We're just keeping tabs on them. But by 5:50 a.m., it was obvious Lutyens that the approaching ships meant to attack him. He sent a terse radio message to his headquarters: "I am engaging 2 heavy ships." Then he prepared himself for the battle to come. In all 4 ships, in oft-rehearsed production, 1 ton of high explosive shells were hauled up to the huge gun turrets by a complex system of pulleys and rails from magazines deep inside the hull. In Bismarck and Hood, these monstrous projectiles were 38 or 41 centimeters, 15 or 16 inches across, and were loaded into guns 6 and 20 feet long and weighed 100 tons each. Holland gave the order to open fire at 21 km, 13 miles, and almost all at once 4 ships began exchanging broadsides. At these distant shells would take up half a minute to reach their target. It was just before 6 a.m., so loud was the roar of the huge guns that they could be heard in Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. But when the battle began, it soon became apparent that Hood's reputation had been undeserved. Built just after the First World War, she had been given heavy steel protection along her vertical surfaces when current warship designs assumed enemy shells would travel in low and hit her sides. 20 years later, such assumptions no longer applied. By 1940, warships aimed their shells in high arc trajectories. They plunged down top of the decks and turrets. Here were Hood's weakest spots, and the Bismarck's second and third shot boat had an astonishing effect on the British ship. Men aboard Bismarck and Prince Eugen watched in astonishment as their much feared opponent exploded like a giant firework, lifting the entire front half up out of the water and breaking the battleship in two. A huge, strangely silent sheet of flame shot high in the air, as intense as a blowtorch, and so high, so bright it could be seen over 50 km, 30 miles away. Hood turned over and sank in less than 5 minutes. In bleakest of battlegrounds, Vice Admiral Holland and all of but 3 of his 1,421 crew died. 1,421 crew died. Prince of Wales veered sharply to avoid hitting the Hood. She was in deep trouble herself. 7 shells from Prince Eugen and Bismarck had hit her, including one at the bridge which had killed everyone there but Captain John Leach and 2 of his officers. Several of her main gun turrets had also jammed. Sensing another catastrophe, and with no chance of destroying either German ship, Leach ordered a speedy retreat. Aboard the Bismarck and Prince Eugen, there was an atmosphere of euphoria. These crews had led to believe that they were aboard the most powerful warships on the planet. And events proved this to be true, hadn't they? Yet the atmosphere on Bismarck's bridge was strained. Lieutenants and Litterman had exchanged sharp words about wisdom of going after Prince of Wales. Even though she was an easy target, Lutyens had decided to stick to his original mission, sinking any merchant ships. He was not prepared to take any unnecessary risks. And there was bad news too. Although Prince Eugen escaped unscathed, Bismarck had taken 2 shells from the Prince of Wales. Men had been killed, and the ship's medical bay was filling up with burned and scalded casualties. Most serious of all, a shell sailed clean through the front of the ship, close to the bow. It had not exploded, but left a man-sized hole just above the waterline. As Bismarck lurked up and down through the choppy ocean, the sea flooded in and drained out, gradually filling the surrounding compartments with 2,000 tons of water. Fuel lines had been broken, leaving 1,000 tons of fuel in the forward tanks cut off from the engine room, and the ship was seeping a sickly brown trail of oil. Part of the ship's engine had also been damaged. News of Hood's destruction caused a sensation across the world. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would recall its single worst moment of war. The British admiralty issued a a famous order: sink the Bismarcks, and 4 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, 21 destroyers were dispatched to avenge the Hood. The man given the responsibility of hunting down the Bismarck was Admiral John Tovey, commander of the British Home Fleet, a small, dapper man whose sharp, determined features gave him something of the look of a bull terrier. Tovey had considerable forces at his disposal, including his own flagship, King George V. Tovey's first task to ensure the Bismarck did not vanish from sight. The North Atlantic, after all, stretched for more than 1 million nautical square miles. Although she was still being shadowed by for smaller British vessels, it would be easy enough to lose her. On the morning of Bismarck's first extraordinary day in action, the rain and drizzle eventually gave way to an occasional hint of sunshine. But the sea was still heaving. Lütjens and Linderman had been considering their options. Their ship was losing fuel and taking in water. Although it still had full firepower, it now lacked speed, an essential attribute for its hit-and-run mission. Lütjen ordered the Prinz Eugen to break away from Bismarck and continue alone. He would take his own ship back to Port Saint-Nazaire, France for repairs. At their current speed, they should take 2,700 km, 107,000 miles, journey in just under 4 days. Meanwhile, the British made their first counterattack with Swordfish torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Victorious. These giant biplanes looked like relics from the First World War. They lumbered dangerously slowly through the sky. Bismarck fought off the Swordfish with ease, her AA anti-aircraft guns putting up a protective sheet of flame that prevented the planes from launching their torpedoes accurately. There was one hit, but it caused minimal damage. But far to the south, another British aircraft carrier was hurrying up to intercept Bismarck. The Ark Royal and her Swordfish crews had also proved to be far more deadly. Sunday, May 25th, the Lütjen's birthday. He had always believed that he would die on this mission, and had resigned himself to the fact that this would be his last ever birthday. That midday, he made a speech to his men, talking to them over the ship's PA system, the PA. And something to do with his dark mood rubbed off on his crew, still exuberant from their brush with the Hood and the Prince of Wales. The Hood was the pride of England, he told them. The enemy would now attempt to concentrate his forces and set them on us. The German nation is with you. We will fight till our gun barrels glow red, and the last shell has left the breach. For us soldiers now, it is victory or death. It was not a diplomatic choice of words, but even admirals are human, and Lütjens knew all too well what was coming, but he was too pessimistic. During the night of May 25th, Bismarck had outrun her British pursuers, and when dawn came, they had lost sight of her. But Lütjens did not know this. Later that day, he sent a long, despondent message to German High Command. This was picked up by British radio trackers who concentrated an aerial search in the area where they detected the signal, but even then, luck was still with Lütjens. Tovey fleet miscalculated his position, assuming Bismarck was heading back to Norway rather than France. They alerted their own pursuit course accordingly. It would be a whole 31 hours before British found the Bismarck. Around 10:30 on the morning of May 26th, observant members of the crew noticed RAF Catalina flying boat circling just outside range of their AA guns. By now, the ailing battleship was approaching the Bay of Biscay. The port of St. Nazar was a mere day or so away, as the imminent prospect of both U-boat and air escort. Bismarck's position was duly reported by Catalina, and Toby's fleet altered course to the south. The carrier Ark Royal was closing in fast. It was a huge bulk heaving alarmingly in a rough sea, amid torrents of seawater that sprayed the flight deck. Ground crews prepared the ponderous swordfish bombers, loading heavy torpedoes to their undersides. In the middle of the afternoon, 15 swordfish lumbered into the air. They did not expect to sink the Bermish, but they hoped at least they could cause enough damage to slow her down, so that pursuing British warships could catch up and attack. Slipping through low cloud, fog, and driving rain, they pounced, flying just above churning waves to unleash their torpedoes toward their target. If the crews of the Swordfish were surprised by the complete lack of defense fire from the ship below, it did not cause them to pause and consider their target. All the torpedoes missed, which was fortunate for the Swordfish crews, because the ship it actually attacked was their British cruiser Sellafield. Amid huge humiliation and embarrassment, a second wave of 15 Swordfish sent off into slow-falling dust. This time they found Bismarck. Still 1,000 km, 620 miles away from St. Nazar, they moved so slowly they seemed to be hanging in the air. But they flew in so low their wheels almost brushing the waves, that Bismarck's guns could not only fire above them, this time 2 torpedoes hit home. One caused only minor damage, the other went off underneath the stern. With a huge watery explosion that shot like a whiplash through the length of the ship, it buckled deck plates and bulkheads, and threw men to the floor against metal partitions and instruments with breathtaking violence. Above the side of the flooding height of the explosion, water surged into the ship with a vengeance. Flooding the entire steering compartment, the sea burst through once waterproof compartments. It gushed down cable pipes and ran the length of the ship to spurt out unexpectedly far away from the site of damage. Aboard the Royal Ark, senior commanders listened to the wildly excited reports of their young pilots and tried to sift the fact from fiction to determine exactly what damage had been done. One pilot account seemed to indicate something extremely sufficient. After the attack, the Bismarck had seemed to make 2 huge circles on her course, then slow down almost to a halt. Clearly her steering had been badly damaged. In fact, the rudder had jammed at 15 to port. Aboard the stricken vessel, desperate measures were called for. The Bismarck carried 3 seaplanes. Planes were made to remove the hangar door where they were stored and weld it to the side of the stern to counteract the effect of the rudder. But bad weather made such a scheme impossible. Following the Swordfish attack, Lieutenant sent another grim signal home. Ship no longer steering. German naval authorities reacted by ordering U-boats to head for the Bismarck's position as soon as possible. But U-boats are not the swiftest of vessels, and there were none nearby. Informed of Bismarck's grim predicament, Hitler had a radio signal sent to lieutenants. All of Germany is with you. What can still be done will be done. The performance of your duty will strengthen our people in the struggle for their existence. It was not a message that offered any hope of survival. Bismarck's crew passed a long, dreadful night, each man wondering whether he would live to see another dusk. Many had nightmares, and men woke up screaming or sobbing. When word spread about the rubber rudder had been put out of action, the older members of the crew took this to be a death sentence. Later in the night, permission was given for the crew to help themselves to anything they wanted: food, drink, tactic, admissions that the ship was doomed. But Lidman had assured them U-boats and aircrafts were heading out to protect them, and some of their younger sailors still had held out hope that they would. During the night, Linderman ordered the engines to stop when the chief engineer requested they be started again. Linderman said, "Ack, you do as you like." After 5 nights, with virtually no sleep, and all the stress and worry of commanding a ship with now impossible situation, he was a man at the end of his tether. To keep the crew from brooding over much about the battle to come, records of popular songs were played over the ship's PA system. But such obvious physiological tactics failed. Songs reminded the men too much of girlfriends or wives and families back home. The Linderman had also come up with the ruse of getting men with no immediate job to do a constructed dummy funnel of wood and canvas. The idea was to change the Bismarck's silhouette so that enemy ships or aircraft would think it's another battleship and leave it alone. This was some considerable task, and the men were kept busy painting the canvas and building the scaffolding structure right through the day. At the first light on May 27th, the day Bismarck hoped to reach the safety of a French port, Tovey and his fleet closed in. To finish the job, along with his own flagship, King George V, was the huge battleship Rodney. Cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire, and several others aboard the Bismarck, exhausted lookouts saw 2 massive ships heading straight for them. Tovey intended the sight of King George V and Rodney boldly closing in to unnerve the German crew, and it worked. The battle that followed, which started with a salvo from Rodney at 8:47 a.m., was unspeakably grisly. As they homed in, the British ships took carefully timed evasive action, darting one way then another to avoid Bismarck's powerful guns. This time luck was with the British, and a few of the Bismarck shells found their mark. By 8:59 a.m., King George V and Rodney were both firing steadily. 4 salvos a minute were falling around Bismarck's, which was now completely obscured by smoke and spray from huge towering columns of water sent into the air by near missiles. At 9:02 a.m., a shell from Rodney hit Bismarck near the bow, and the entire front end of the ship was momentarily swallowed by a blinding sheet of flame. This one shot 10 or so minutes into battle was the most crucial of the day. Huge gun pointed down to the deck, and the other one barrel pointed up, and the other down. In that one explosion, perhaps half the ship's crew had been killed. Only 1 man from the entire front section survived the battle. Bismarck may have been the most technologically advanced battleship in the world, but she was completely outgunned. For a further hour, hundreds of shells fell on her. On deck below, men were blown to pieces or burned to death. As her interior turned into a blazing death trap, as the British ships drew closer, Bismarck's exceptionally effective construction merely made her destruction even more prolonged. As the shelling continued, fierce fires blazed over her deck and structure, and Bismarck began to list to port. By 10:11 a.m., the British ships were close enough to see streams of men leaping into the sea to save themselves from the flames and still exploding shells. When it was obvious the crew were abandoning their ship, Tovey ordered the shelling to stop. Berserk, Fedor von and Mullingham Richburg, fire control officer from Bismarck's afterguns, emerged from his battle station and surveying the damage. The anti-aircraft guns and searchlights once surrounded after the station had disappeared without trace. Where there had been guns, shields, instruments, there was an empty space. The superstructure upper decks were littered with scrap metal, and there were holes in the stack funnel, but it was still standing. Von Muldem Rechberg could see the ship was slowly collapsing. Amid the carnage and rubble, men were running around desperately searching for ways to save themselves. Such was the destruction on the ship, on the decks, that not a single lifeboat, life raft, or float remained. Then, amid the smoke and ruin, Von Melrenrich saw doctors busy attending to the wounded, giving them painkillers, morphine jabs to ease their agony. Many men were trapped inside the ship as fires cut off escape routes, and shells buckled hatches, which now no longer opened. Some were able to escape by climbing up shell hoists, wiring shafts, or any other kind of duct large enough to take a man. Many other ships gave up hope and sat where they could, waiting for the ship to go down. But still the Bismarck stayed afloat. During the morning, Tovey was expecting both submarine and air attack by German forces, and was anxious to leave the area as quickly as possible. He ordered any ship with torpedoes left to fire at the Bismarck, send her into the bottom of the sea. The Dorshire fired 3 from close range, and all struck home. Finally, at 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck turned over and sank. To this day, it is unclear whether or not she sank because of these torpedoes, or because her crew deliberately flooded her to keep their ship from falling into British hands. Men in their water near the bow witnessed one final extraordinary scene. Although Lieutenant Jens had been killed by shell fire early in battle, Captain Litterman had survived. Now he sided with the junior officer standing near the front of the ship, seawater fast approaching the sinking bows. From his gesture, he appeared to be urging his men to save themselves. But men refused to stay next to Linderman. Then, as the deck slowly turned over sea, Linderman stopped and raised a hand to cap a final silhouette, then disappeared afterwards. One survivor recalled, "I always thought such things happened only in books, but I saw it with my own eyes." By now, the Dorshire and the destroyer Maori were the only remaining ships at the scene, close to where the Bismarck had gone down. British sailors could see hundreds of tiny heads floating in the water. Bismarck's crew had been told that the British shot their prisoners. A sly piece of Nazi propaganda designed to ensure German military forces will always be reluctant to surrender. But as the freezing survivors swam toward British ships, they discovered this was not the case. Men were hurriedly huddled down aboard. But in a cruel twist of fate, a lookout from the shore spotted a whiff of smoke a couple miles away, which was thought to be a German U-boat. The German ships were immediately ordered to move off. Although there were Although over 100 men were rescued, 300 were left in the water. As the day wore on, these exhausted men who had seen their hopes of survival raised, then crushed, slowly succumbed into the intense cold of the ocean. Only 5 lived to tell the tale. 3 were picked up by a U-boat and 2 German weather ships. When the German ships arrived at the scene, they found only rubble lifeboats and a few floating bodies. Bismarck turned completely upside down on her descent to the ocean floor, 5 km 3 miles below, and her 4 huge gun turrets fell from their housings. By the time she hit the slopes of a vast underwater volcano 20 minutes later, she had righted herself and set off a huge landslide which carried her further down the slope. There she lies today, where she was recently discovered by the marine archaeologist Robert Bullard in 1989. His underwater cameras showed the hull remains intact. Shells, barnacles, and sundry and other small sea creatures line the wooden planks of the deck. And the fresh paint applied a few days ago before she sank gradually dissolved in the seawater. The Swackies and Bismarck's bow and stern had made a sinister reappearance. End of 11.